Remember your favorite paint range from the late 2000s? Formula P3 is back, baby! Following the unexpected acquisition of the War Machine license, Steamforged Games have relaunched the iconic P3 range via Kickstarter. They're promising an updated formula and a fresh start. P3 was once hailed as the go-to paint for wet blending, but does it still hold up? And in a market now brimming with high-quality miniature paints, is that enough to make P3 stand out? I'm Stahly from Tale of Painters, and in this review I'll test the entire new P3 range to answer these questions and more. Formula P3 was originally developed by Mike McVeigh, one of the most iconic heavy metal painters of the 90s, who also had a hand in the vintage Citadel color ranges. Launched in 2006, Formula P3 quickly gained a loyal following alongside the rising success of the Warmer Hordes game system. However, over the years, the range saw little innovation or expansion, and when Privateer Press began scaling back their miniature lines, availability of P3 dried up almost completely. It seemed the range was fading into obscurity as many painters began shifting to more modern and more readily available paints. But I still have a soft spot for the P3 range, and when I saw the Kickstarter announcement, I wondered, are these still the P3 paints we know and love? How do they perform compared to the originals, and can they keep up with more modern paint ranges? I got my hands on the entire range and tested each and every of the 110 paints thoroughly. So let's see if Steamforged Games has managed to improve on what was already good, or if they have potentially skimped on the quality to make a quick buck on Kickstarter. If you backed P3 there, you could choose between dropper bottles and the old school flip-top pots. However, the retail paints will be sold in dropper bottles only, containing 18 ml of paint and 2 mixing bowls each, which are always a welcome addition. The refreshed P3 palette has grown to 110 colors with 18 metallics and 1 mixing medium. This is noticeably smaller than many other hobby paint ranges these days, but a second wave of more colors is already planned. The selection of primary and secondary colors is thus a bit limited, as neutral and brown tones are proportionally somewhat overrepresented. The colors are loosely organized, there isn't some sort of tried system like in other ranges. However, there is a leaflet with suggested color combinations for shading and highlighting, which you can probably download somewhere. While there are plenty of new paints, not all old colors made it to the new range though. For example, they ditched all of the washes and inks. Maybe these will return in a future wave, but I wasn't a huge fan of them anyways. For me, the regular acrylics have always been the star of the P3 range. I'll show you how the new P3 acrylics stand up to the previous generation in a moment, but first I want to take a look at the metallics. As I often say, metallics are usually a good indicator of the overall quality of a paint range. And being brutally honest, I found the old Formula P3 metallics to be hit or miss. I don't know about you, but I found some of them were quite decent, but most reminded me of the consistency and covering power of the Citadel layer metallics. You know, the more mediocre ones, not the better ones with the white caps. And that's no surprise, as P3 paints are made by HMG in the UK, which used to make the current Citadel color range before Games Workshop moved the production in-house. I made a video about the secret changes in the Citadel color range. Check it out if you haven't yet. It's a must-watch for anyone using Citadel paints. And while you're at it, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I guide you through the jungle of miniature paint releases with the latest news and reviews, often before other channels do. So the new P3 metallics are different. Apparently, Steamforged Games, similar to Two Thin Coats, uses a new technique employing colored aluminum particles instead of mixing silver metallic particles with a dye to tint them. This results in high covering power and a smooth finish with a fine metallic texture. The sheen is also super nice. Once dry, the metallics look fantastic, especially if you prefer your metallics a bit shinier and sparklier rather than matte and smooth. The consistency is cohesive, though the medium doesn't seem to bind the metallic flakes quite as evenly as with Vallejo's Mecca Color or Model Air metallics, and the paints need a lot of shaking. I also found that especially the metallic and pearlescent colors in the Irregulars paint set are all very light, which naturally makes the covering power quite weak. Although, to be fair, that's the same with similar pearl metallics in other paint ranges like AK 3rd Gen. All of this taken together, I'm finding it difficult to give a rating. Still, the new P3 metallics are a clear improvement over the old versions and easily hold their own against ranges like Tooth & Coats and Warpaint's Fanatic. They're not quite the toppest of top tier in my book, though the potential for a score of 9 would have been there if not for the Irregulars. As it stands, I would still give them a very respectable 8 out of 10. My favorites are probably the bronze and copper colors, which have outstanding covering power. Let me know about your experiences with the metallics in the comments if you already got yours from Kickstarter. Right, having now tried the metallics, I'm a bit worried about testing the acrylics. You see, I absolutely love some of the old Formula P3 colors and I really look after them in my collection. So let's see if the new P3 acrylics are an improvement or more of a sidestep. I remember that back in the late 2000s, Formula P3 was a breath of fresh air. All we had was Games Workshop and Vallejo, plus eventually Reaper paints when you lived in the US. The P3 palette was perfectly tailored to the model range of the Iron Kingdoms with matching 6-packs for each faction. This led to many quirky and unique colors that you couldn't find elsewhere at that time. For example, the iconic grey-green of Krix, Manoth Burgundy, or the pale turquoise skin of the Trollkin. What really won me over though were the bone and mocha brown colors. These are still part of my daily rotation, and later in this video I'll compare if the new generation can color match the old versions. But apart from the color selection, what made P3 paints stand out for me was the silky consistency and slightly longer drying time. This made them perfect for blending, and beautiful blends were the trademark of Privateer Press's studio painting style. Let's see if that's still the case. At first glance, when I put the new P3 on my palette, I feel that it didn't change too much. Okay, the paints now come in dropper bottles instead of those containers where the hinge always seemed to break after a few weeks. But the paint itself feels pretty much identical. The consistency is as silky as you remember, not too thick, not too thin. The paint glides off the brush really well, and the thinning and glazing properties are fantastic, which also benefits airbrushing. So even though Steamforged Games hasn't drastically changed the feeling of the paints, they have managed to improve a crucial aspect. As good as the old Formula P3 range was for its time, there was one problem. Most of the colors had a high pigment density, but tricky colors like white, yellow, red, purple and light green had only a weak covering power. Back then, technology behind hobby paints simply wasn't at the level it is today. Especially brighter colors are now much more heavily pigmented and opaque without sacrificing too much vibrancy. And you don't need to be a Golden Demon level painter to benefit from it. One of my favorite new paints is Cardo Red. A bright neutral red that covers black in just 2 to 3 thin coats. A fantastic upgrade over the old version. What stayed the same though is the finish. It's proper old school satin glossy, just as you remember it. I think it goes well with the color palette as the gloss adds even more depth to the rich and highly saturated colors. You either love it or hate it, but seeing as the trend is leaning more towards matte paints, the gloss is definitely a unique selling point of P3. And speaking of USPs,
will it blend? That is the question.
Well, the drying time is still longer than with, for example, Games Workshop or Warpaint's Fanatic. This gives you a longer working time for blending. In my tests, I had no trouble mixing 2 colors on the model while still wet with a second clean brush. So yes, it's true that P3 paints are well suited for blending. But it's also part of the truth that many of the more modern paint ranges have an increased amount of drying retarder and flow improver added. For example, Pro Acryl, Two Thin Coats and Vallejo. In my opinion, this makes these paint ranges just as good for blending. In fact, Two Thin Coats has an even longer drying time, which in theory should make blending even easier. Two Thin Coats also has slightly better self-leveling properties and is more forgiving when it comes to avoiding visible brush strokes. So the idea that P3 is the paint for wet blending is at the end of the day a marketing thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing though, and I should also mention that I'm not the best wet blender in the world. I know that other creators such as Ninjon, who paint at a much higher level than me, swear by P3 for blending, so there must be some truth to it. So I don't want to criticize that, but if I had to be picky, it would be that a few colors didn't have the same consistent texture as the rest, similar to the metallics. My Tharma Black, for example, was a bit too thin for my taste. But one question remains before I can give my score and final verdict. Not all colors from the old P3 range were carried over into the new one, and some older colors got renamed. But for the colors that stayed, have they remained consistent in tone, which is crucial for matching older paint jobs, or have they changed? To check this, I grabbed a random selection of old and new paints and put them side by side. Here's the result. By and large, the new versions match the old ones quite well, but not 100% perfectly. Which is why I say what I always say during a range refresh: if you rely on a specific color, stock up while there are still some old paints around. And be aware that P3 paints have changed over the years. I have an older and newer pot of coal black, and the newer version is a nuance lighter and the consistency a bit thinner. I also have a pot of Battlefield Brown that is more reddish and one that is more neutral. If you want to compare the new P3 paints for yourself, I've created a professional digital swatch featuring the entire range. It's made from real hand-painted samples and much more accurate than Steamforged Games' own graphic, and fully cross-compatible with my library of other swatches, so you can make direct comparisons with ease. You'll find my swatches and my interactive 7-in-1 document over on Patreon, so you'll never have to accidentally buy the wrong paints for your projects again. And with that, let's get to the conclusion and my final verdict. Steamforged Games haven't reinvented the wheel with this new generation of paints. But they didn't need to, because the original P3 paints were already pretty solid. They've built on their strength and made smart refinements like improving pigmentation and boosting the covering power of the weaker colors. And while the metallics left me with a somewhat mixed impression for now, they're still a step up from the old versions. If you're after a paint range that's compact yet distinctive, with a well-balanced selection of vibrant, saturated colors alongside versatile browns and neutral tones, and you're not put off by a glossy finish, then the revamped P3 range is definitely worth a look. I'm giving the new acrylics a solid 8 out of 10, which is also my overall score for Wave 1. As for alternatives, I would say that Pro Acryl is a strong contender. It also offers a lean selection of colors, blends exceptionally well, but has a matte finish if you prefer that. You can find my video on Pro Acryl in the signature series right here, so go watch this next for comparison. See you soon and happy hobbying!